When economics blogger Noah Smith announced last year that he thinks Tokyo is the world's greatest city, similar to what Paris was for past generations, many people took notice. On August 9th, the Japan Society of Northern California held an in-person event titled Why Tokyo is the New Paris. During the seminar, Noah Smith, owner and writer of an economics-focused newsletter titled Noahpion, discussed the charms and successes of Tokyo. The event also includes talks from Stephen Katayama, the Managing Director of Global Sales for the Western Regional Sales Office of Japan Airlines, and Chikahiro Honda, the Director of Administration for the Western Regional Office of Japan Airlines. This event was moderated by Rochelle Kopp, the founder and managing principal of Japan Intercultural Consulting and a board member of the Japan Society of Northern California.
Hello. All right, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to get started soon, so if you can find your seats, I would greatly appreciate that. We are really excited today about our topic, and today's topic is Tokyo is the new Paris. And we have a wonderful panel that we have today, and I'm going to introduce them. But first, I will introduce myself. My name is Dewan Mercado. I am the program coordinator here at the Japan Society of Northern California. So my first question is, how many people's first event is today for the Japan Society? Oh, wow, that's a lot. That's good. And another question I have is, how many people here know of Noah Smith? Who's here for Noah? Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you, Noah. I'm glad you're here for yourself. Okay, so as I said, we at the Japan Society, our mission is to bridge Northern California Bay Area with Japan. How do we do that? We do that through a gambit of events running from high-level talks dealing with AI regulations between the United States and Japan, US and Japan space regulations, semiconductor chips. But we also have more fun events, like we'll have events with Japanese taiko, which is drumming, Japanese archery, Japanese kimono. And we have an event almost every week, and the majority of our events are free. Not only that, since we are talking about traveling, going to Japan, one thing that we also provide is Japanese language classes. We actually just opened up our classes this week. Most of our classes are online, but we also have classes in San Francisco as well as San Mateo. So if you're interested in brushing up on your Japanese before going to Japan, I highly recommend that you check out our website and sign up for classes because they do fill up quickly. Now, moving on to the event, we have Noah Smith. He is a renowned blogger. He used to write for Bloomberg Opinion, focusing on economics. He also used to work for Sony University and got his PhD from the University of Michigan. I've been told, he's lived in Japan for a while, and I've heard he might even be moving back. Well, who knows? Maybe he'll tell us more about that. He's currently working on a book about how Japanese companies can enter the international market. We also have two representatives here today from JLA, Stephen Katayama and Chikahiro Honda, and they're going to be talking about how you can get to Japan. There's many ways you can go, there's many providers, but one of them is JLA, and they're going to tell you all about, JAL, sorry, I'm speaking fast, JAL, I apologize. And they're going to tell us all the wonderful ways that you can get there. So if you have any questions or you're curious, they're going to be able to help you out with that. And we also have our moderator here today, Rochelle Kopp. She is a board member for the Japan Society, but she's also the principal founder for Japan Intercultural Consulting. So if you work in that sphere and you're curious about that, make sure to give her, say hi at the end of the event. I am now going to pass it on to Noah to begin his presentation. So let me pull that up for you. Yes, pull up his presentation.
All right, I have my
Oh, sorry.
It's working, right? Okay. Oh yeah, there we go. So I use the type of slides that just have pictures on them, so you don't get distracted reading. I left out all the equations. So I've been writing a series of posts recently about Japanese urbanism, and basically everyone wants to go to Japan. Usually this means Tokyo, but really just all of Japan. And there's basically three things that are going on. One is a tourism boom that everyone knows about. partly due to the cheap yen, partly due to the fact that the Japanese government really tried to promote tourism. And so everyone basically got the idea that Japan is a place you can go. And then so the second is investment. There's a lot of people wanting to invest in Japan, especially AI companies, interestingly. And big tech companies are investing a lot in Japan. That's kind of a surprise because that was not as true in the past. And the third is immigration. People want to move to Japan, not necessarily to work for Japanese companies, sometimes to work for the foreign companies that are investing there, often just people who can work remote and want somewhere to live. So, and this may include me. I work for myself. I'm self-employed, but I may move back to Japan. Japanese cities are really, really great. And I think if you ask why do people want to move to Japan, if you ask why do people want to move to America, they want a big house in the suburbs. Well, no one wants to go out and live in the suburbs in Japan. Everyone wants to live in the cities, and everyone wants to visit the cities. People visit nature stuff too, but I think that cities are really the key. And I tried to get a variety of photos here that really that captures the diversity of things you'll find, from quiet cafes to bustling lit up streets to parks, etc. And I think that basically Japanese cities are like no other cities on earth, and Tokyo is of course the biggest and most impressive Japanese city. Tokyo is the new Paris wasn't just about Tokyo, obviously. It's just it's a metaphor. But yeah, so the question is, what allows Japanese cities to be so great? And that's what I've been kind of writing about. Wait, how's this? Oh, so the first reason is simply because Japan is willing to build things. And amazingly, if you don't build things, you cannot have a city. Somehow, some cities have forgotten this. You'll see that since 1970, Tokyo has really just built far more housing than Paris, London, or New York. Sort of big cities and other big dense cities in developed countries. Those cities basically built up to a certain radius and then stopped. I had another graph. I didn't want to put too many charts on here, but and then back in the 1980s, some French documentary maker said that Japan is a nation of rich people who live in rabbit hutches. Well, as a rabbit guy myself, I let my rabbit run around everywhere. He doesn't live in a hutch, but I understand the idea because I have lived in a six rokujo, like Japanese apartment, like a small one. And then that's not even the smallest you can get. But because of that, because they built so much, there's now tons of space. So now Tokyo, as a decade ago, Tokyo had already rivaled London and Paris in terms of floor space per person, and now it has increased more since then. And so I think they'll rival New York soon, because they just keep building and building. And so this means that Tokyo is an amazing place, but it's a much more amazing place than it was in 1985 or something. It's while New York is about the same as it was maybe in New York's about as good as it was in 2000, in the year 2000, whereas Tokyo is just incomparably bigger and better. All right, so why is Tokyo so great? Everyone talks about building housing, and I just talked about building housing, and everyone talks about how many people can you fit in this place. In fact, Tokyo doesn't fit the most people in the city compared to other cities. Obviously Indian cities fit the most, but then Hong Kong fits more. Actually, New York is about as dense as Tokyo. New York City itself is about as dense as Tokyo's 23 wards. But Tokyo has something that none of those cities have, which is commercial density, which is the kind of density we don't often talk about. It's not about how many people you can cram in, it's about how many shops you have. Tokyo has far more restaurants than New York City, far more restaurants than Paris, or anywhere else, far more restaurants than Hong Kong. Really, and I tried to pick a couple of photos where you can really see this. Those are Zakyo buildings, which we barely have in America. And most countries have only a few of them. Japan has them everywhere. That's basically Zakyo is just assorted stuff. In buildings you can have like any kind of retail or anything just mixed together in a building, and people take the elevators up. It's really easy to get there from the street. You can get there from the street. And they also have yokocho, which are these shopping out, like drinking, eating alleys, right? These cool little shopping alleys. And then they have malls, and then they have under track spaces, and they have just a million different places where you have a ton of little small businesses. And Japanese people actually start businesses at rates higher than native born Americans. That might be surprising, but it's because so many Japanese people are small business people. You have this massive reservoir of people who want to start their own small retail business, usually retail business. And so because of this, Japanese cities end up feeling like there's always something to do. It's because of these little businesses. There's always another restaurant to eat at. There's always another boutique clothing store to shop at. There's always a hobby shop. There's always more stuff. And the stuff brings people. And the people enable the stuff. There's a two-sided, effect there where, there's a lot of foot traffic because people want to go to all those stores. And then because there's all these people around, you can fit more stores in to serve the people who are walking by. And so it ends up the whole, so the secret to how they do this, by the way, is zoning. So in America, zoning is determined by local zoning boards. In Japan, zoning is determined by the central government determines what kind of zones you're allowed to have. And then you can pick which of these. So these are the kind of zones you can have. It's very simple. And almost all of these allow for mixed use. Almost all of these allow you to have housing and stores in the same place. So I picked a photo where you can see how, here's somebody lives there, and then here's all these little businesses. And this is not in the middle of a city. This is not like in New York City where you have loft apartments above a ground level retail, or Hong Kong's like that too. This is a local neighborhood. It's not quite a suburb, but it's maybe like this would be in like, I don't know, Prospect Heights, I don't know, or like the Outer Sunset or something like that. It's much more mixed use. And in America, these would be along big commercial corridors, right? Like Clement Street or something, or Geary. But here, it's just scattered throughout neighborhoods. What happens is that you feel like the entire neighborhood is your backyard. Maybe you have a small place to live, but you feel like you can just walk outside of the place, and then you're just in your, you're still in your neighborhood, you're in your backyard. You haven't really left. And at least I feel this way, and I think a lot of people I talk to feel the same way. Japanese cities have lots of other advantages. It's good to have no violent crime. Some of these other places could pull off the same thing. I don't think people are afraid to walk around the streets in Germany or Australia, but America is going to have trouble because our homicide rate's gone down a bit. It's 5 now, but still like way higher. It's 20 times as high as Japan, and so people. Obviously, it differs greatly by neighborhood, but America is a violent enough place where people try to block train stations because they think that dangerous people will ride the train to where your house is and then kill you or beat you up or whatever, or take your money. And then so low levels of crime are really important. That said, Tokyo and Japanese cities in general still do a lot better on many of these things than cities with comparably low levels of crime. So it's not the only thing, but it's important. Good urban planning is really important too. And so I really recommend this book, Emergent Tokyo, by Joe McReynolds, and who's my friend, and the other people who wrote that book, Jorge Almazan. But there were like tons of people who wrote that book. But like, yeah, Jorge Almazan, Joe McReynolds, and this shows how this shows what they call a pocket neighborhood, where you basically have residential stuff and like small commercial stuff in the middle, and then you have all these big malls on the outside that protect it. The malls are protecting the neighborhood, and so cars don't drive through there because the streets are all small, right? They drive on the big roads outside, and so it creates something like what super blocks were supposed to be, but actually much larger than a traditional super block would have been. And it does it very naturally instead of the sort of cookie cutter Le Corbusier developments that I think don't look very good. Obviously, the Japan's number one most important thing is trains. They just build great trains everywhere. This is a map of this is a full train map of the greater Tokyo area. This is everywhere you can use your Suica card. your train card in the greater Tokyo area. And it is impressive. I mean, like, basically, you're never farther than 15-minute walk from a train station and almost always closer than that. You know, you never really have to, only if you go to the extreme burbs do you end up having to take a car anywhere, even a bus. And so those are really, so, all right, so who cares about this? Why does this matter at all? Yes, Japan is great, go to Japan. Let's talk about what I'm writing this book about. The tentative title for the book, the publishers really like, is Weeb Economy. And for those of you who've never heard the word weeb, it means a non-Japanese person who's really interested in Japanese stuff, who really likes Japanese stuff. And so I feel like people in Japan are largely unaware that weebs exist, but even so, weebs are taking over the world. You know, the younger generation, certainly in countries like the United States, Indonesia, Brazil, these people just, anime is their language that they use to express everything. And manga, you know, cosplay, Japanese video games, and things like that. Even more than Korea, I'd say. Even more than, you know, I mean, Korea's done very well with K-pop and K-dramas and all that stuff. But I'd say that Japan, even more so, has become the #1 cultural exporter on the planet. And the result is weeb culture, which so everyone wants to go live in Japan. Almost nobody realizes that they can do it, but that's changing. That's changing. People are realizing that they can live in Japan. So now what the Japanese government has to do is take people's natural desire to live in Japan and use this to get foreign direct investment, to get people to set up their startups in Japan, to get companies like, you know, fast-growing companies to set up offices in Japan. So for example, I have friends at Midjourney who just made an office in Tokyo. And so because Japan's becoming a little bit of a hotbed for AI research right now. Maybe #2 to America. I guess it's China. But then, so basically, obviously, these are a special class of weeb who, you know, but this, you know, your average person who wants to go to Japan and found a startup, you know, live in Tokyo and do their startup there is probably not dressing in costumes like this, but they might be. All right, I know people who do. Palmer Luckey. All right, the Anduril guy dresses up in costumes like that, and he's married to a woman who, you know, is another, like, just regular middle American, white American person who does this professionally. She's a professional cosplayer. So there are some weebs who are that weeby. And who are that weeby. And so basically, my thesis is that Japan can harness people's love of living in Japanese cities to reintegrate the Japanese economy with global supply chains, to get foreign direct investment, to, you know, basically reclaim its centrality to supply chains, especially in the generalized electronics industry, but also in other industries as well, in a way that I think there hasn't really been a big push to do this yet. But there needs to be, and it can be done. And so this is sort of one element of how that can be done. And I can say more later, but I think that's all I prepared for.
Okay.
That any more slides?
No, I think that's it. Excellent. So you know, I love the idea of kind of Tokyo being taken over by people who are
By
trying
weebs.
So my thought is Japan really ready for this? And so I have a couple of questions for you about that. So one, if we just talk about the tourism. And so the first step before people might move to Japan is, well, I want to go visit. And living in Japan right now, I feel that systems are already kind of groaning under the weight of increased tourism. And I live on the Toei-Asakusa line, which you can use it to get directly to Narita or directly to Haneda, which means there are a lot of tourists who are on my train line with giant suitcases. And in rush hour, and I'm tripping over those suitcases, I'm like, why do we have so many people visiting here? So what do you think Japan can do if the tourists are overstraining some of the capacity in the society?
So I actually think that the tourism boom is helpful for raising awareness, but it's, in terms of the economy, it's not actually that helpful. The amount of dollars you get from tourism is not that big, and it really does place a strain on the local economy. Nobody's thought of what to do, but there's a very simple policy you can use to fix it, which is a surtax on hotel reservations made to buyers outside the country. That is a tourism tax, and it's a tourism tax that tourists never see. They just know hotel prices. And you can raise or lower the surtax as much as you want to compensate for exchange rate movements. What it allows you to do is finally modulate the amount of tourists you let in, as well as getting government revenue. So it's a tariff on tourism, and it's specifically on people staying in Tokyo. It's very easy to track because you know who's making, when some hotel is making a reservation to someone overseas. You know when Airbnb is doing it overseas, and yeah, so that's what I do, and I dial down the tourism a bit, and also gain revenue for the government.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a very elegant solution.
I was an economist at some point.
I also feel like there should be some way to try and get tourists outside of Tokyo. That I find it's much more interesting in Japan to travel to rural areas. And those are often just as or more interesting than the really big cities.
Well, they're interesting to you because you've lived in Japan a long time and you know the city so well. But when you go, when you go to Japan for the first time, stepping into, like Shibuya or something is like stepping into an alternate universe. It's like the first time you're a kid and you go to Disney World. It's like, oh my God, I didn't even know places could be like this.
I've seen pictures of the scramble and now I can see it. Yeah,
right. I mean, you know that. You're just like, how do I get across this street? But when I went to Hachiko for the first time, I stood there watching this is before Times Square got similar, big video monitors. I remember I stood there watching the video monitors for about an hour, just standing there in the middle of the square. I had never seen anything like that or imagined it. And, I was in college at the time. And it's good luck getting people to see. I mean, people love nature, right? People are going to go ski, right? People are going to go, and maybe you can promote mountain climbing, river rafting, nature stuff like that. But no one wants to go hang out in a farm town unless that's like the last thing they haven't done in Japan.
Right. What I always think is like a medium-sized city. So I took my husband, who hasn't spent as much time in Japan as me, on a trip to Japan at one point. And as part of our travels, we went to this town called Chikuma in Nagano Prefecture, which I'm guessing no one here has ever heard of, right? And it's a really lovely middle-sized town. And while we were there, we rented, but we borrowed bicycles from our ryokan. There was a part of town where they had restored architecture, Edo period buildings. They had a giant, beautiful Buddhist temple, which had colorful, interesting statues. They had a beautiful, serene Shinto shrine. We were the only people there. It was so quiet that there was a huge owl sitting on the rail of the shrine and just sitting there watching us, like this far away from us. And I thought, this is like the experience of Japan that everyone wants when they go to Kyoto and can't get because there's a million people. And it was just two of us tooling around this medium-sized Japanese city. I'm like, more people should really have that experience.
That would be nice, but also note that my awesome policy of surcharge on hotel reservations overseas takes care of this because you can set it by city.
Right.
So you can charge people to stay in Tokyo, and then you can say, but look how cheap it is to stay in Chikuma.
Yeah, exactly. That sounds like a way to do it. So what about for the immigration side? Is Japanese society ready to have a lot of people living in Japan whose native language isn't Japanese?
No, it's not ready. and it will never be ready. And, but what happens with immigrants that we know is that they have kids, and the kids speak the local language as their primary language, although they often retain the language of their parents. And this process of assimilation happens faster in America and Canada and I think Australia than other countries. But it does happen. It happens in Germany, it happens in Italy, it happens in all these other places, and it happens in Japan too. And so basically, as long as they avoid the temptation to create international schools, as long as they just send kids born in Japan to Japanese schools, then everything will be fine because the kids will grow up speaking Japanese. Now, how Japan deals with people who look racially different than traditional Japanese people, but yet are just only speak Japanese, how they'll deal with racial diversity is another matter. But I would also notice that in terms of mass immigration, almost all Japanese immigration now is from Vietnam and the Philippines. And, you know, after 3 generations, I don't know how visually distinct those people are going to be. But there will be some people, you know, like who just only speak Japanese and just, you know, don't look Asian at all.
No.
And Japanese society is going to have to figure out what to do with that. But, you know, I'm sure they'll, if you know, many things Japan has figured out in a more easy way than America has. So for example, when I lived in Japan in the mid-2000s, it was still extremely homophobic. And gay people were still very underground, and most people thought, ooh, gay, that's weird, you know. Then suddenly overnight, with no, you know, hate crimes, with no like, you know, big legislative battles, with no like, you know, horrible rhetoric from like right-wing churches or whatever, with none of that, suddenly now gay people are like pretty accepted in Japan. And so like that, the fact that it changed later, but it changed more easily. And I think that you know, diversity will be similar. Like Japan just handles things more easily than America.
That's interesting. Well, I feel like there's a real difference between everyday people's attitudes versus what institutions are set up to deal with.
Sure, exactly. But then, but I think the language is the main thing. That's, I think that essentially assimilation is about language. It's just about whether you can talk to people. And yes, and if you're raised speaking a language, you'll speak it.
Well, I know one thing the Japanese government is doing is trying to train a lot more Japanese language teachers, often as a second career for people after retirement, which I think is a great idea. Because you're right, because language is really the key.
Well,
I'm just checking on our time here. We've just
Yeah,
got a couple minutes left. So any other thoughts of what you would recommend to Japan to do to capitalize on this weeb economy idea?
on the weeb economy? Well, I think that basically the idea should be of a two-track economy. Obviously, you know, traditionally Japanese industrial policy focuses on Japanese companies. And there are some important things that Japanese companies need to do that they're not doing now. Many important things, in fact. But the idea of foreigners coming to Japan and starting companies in Japan that then sell overseas and export. That's exactly what's happening with my friends at Midjourney. They're not Japanese. They're setting up shop in Tokyo to make products for whom the main revenue generating customers will not be in Japan at all. So promoting exports via FDI should be a second track that's largely separate from the policies that the Japanese state uses to affect Japanese companies themselves.
Well, I just do feel like it makes a lot of sense for foreign firms to be hiring people in Japan, particularly if they're hiring things like computer programmers, because the labor costs are so low there. And so you can get a fabulous computer programmer for a third of the cost or less of what it costs in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
So if companies do the math, they'd be hiring a lot more people there.
Yeah. The one exception is finance. Actually, finance costs just as much in Japan to hire people.
Interesting.
So, but it's good. You don't want your country to specialize in finance too much.
You can see what happens in that when we do that, right? Very good. Okay, well, these are great thoughts. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna hear from our friends at JAL now with a few ideas on the visiting Tokyo part.
Wait, do we want to take questions first?
And we're gonna take questions after,
Okay.
so all together, okay? So we're gonna have kind of take a quick presentation from them, and then we're gonna have all of us together, we'll answer questions. So think of your questions or save them up. So, you wanna use this? You have your mic, okay, great,
I have my
okay,
mic on, so-
okay.
Oh, the clicker, yes. No, you're fine, sitting there. Thank you very much for allowing Japan Airlines to have some minutes to talk about getting to Japan and access to Japan and such. It's a tough act to follow, Noah. You have all your hand up here, and I should have said I'm giving away free tickets. That would have been more popular. Unfortunately, that's not happening. So, Tokyo being the international gateway to Japan, you know, Japan Airlines 70 years ago, we flew our first flight, international flight, and that was from Narita, Tokyo to San Francisco via Honolulu, Wake Island and Honolulu. They had to take pit stops there. Anyone have any idea how many hours that flight time would have taken? 30? Someone said 30? Very good, very close. It took 31 hours, which now takes only 9 hours from Japan to here and about 11 hours going there. And also that Pardon me? Okay, would you like to guess how much that cost one way? That was 70 years ago, 1954. No, back then, the money back then, it was $650 one way, so $1,300 round trip. Which would be, you know, what I found out was, it was 75 cents per hour was the minimum wage back then. So if you figure that, you know, it was only, what, 18 people, so it was like the first class, you know. There were only 18 flyers, I think we had 4 staff or something. But anyhow, that happened, 70 years ago for us. Now there are various ways to get to Japan, but let me go over the Tokyo. Most people fly into either Haneda or Narita. You know, pretty much probably 80% or even greater probably international flights fly into Tokyo. And 20 million in fiscal year 23, 20 million travelers flew in or out of Haneda. That was a 221% year-over-year growth. And that was 20% greater than pre-COVID, FY19. For Narita, that was 25 million, 277% year-over-year growth. However, just 58% versus pre-COVID. So what's going on? There's been a shift from the airlines from Narita to Haneda because they opened new slots, Haneda slots. That was in 2020, I believe. It was 2020. And not only that, there are other reasons. Airlines such as ourselves, Japan Airlines, and the other major ANA, we have reduced a lot of the Narita flights. They just have been suspended and haven't brought them back. Part of it is because of China, you know, the slowdown of recovery in China. There are other factors as well. But in any case, as I think was mentioned, Narita Airport, Haneda Airport, Narita is further away. It takes about, 60, 70 minutes to 80 minutes to get into Metro Tokyo versus Haneda, it's only like 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Much more convenient. As far as the top visitors, anyone guess where America fell amongst the top countries, visiting countries? For number 4, we're very close. Anyone else guess? 5? Okay. Yeah, number 1. Let's see. It's Korea, 7 million. Yeah. Lots of traffic, it's close by. And then next, what happened there? Oh, there we go. Was Taiwan with 4 million. And China, 2.4. And right below that was Hong Kong. Interesting, they separated Hong Kong and such. And then finally it's USA, we had 2 million travelers. So where we said 2, very, very close, very accurate. And there are various, major carriers. There's basically 4 now that have direct access to Tokyo. I should say just Tokyo, to Japan. Japan Airlines, JAL, ANA, our friendly competitor, and United Airlines each has a daily flight, one to Tokyo and one to Haneda. And United also has a direct flight going to Osaka, to Kansai International Airport. JAL does also have a flight direct to Kansai, but it's from LA to KIX. And one thing I would like to note, basically the schedules are similar. Leave here in the morning, late morning or early afternoon, and get to Tokyo the next afternoon, plus 1 day. The only one is ANA has a red-eye flight now. Leaves at 1:45 in the morning, getting you at 4:30 in the morning. So for some business travelers, or maybe the Japanese business travelers, that might be popular. But for some of the foreigners like this, who have no place to go, you can't check in your hotel and such, so it might be difficult. But and then the newest arrival is Zip Air. They're LCC, a low-cost carrier. They started, and that I must say that is a subsidiary of Japan Airlines. And basically, it's bare bones, and you start adding your suitcase, your seat, your food, and such to the cost of the air, but it is sometimes significantly cheaper. They do have a flight to San Francisco daily. That's the second flight that they added. And San Jose to Narita, it flies 6 days a week. Okay. And Rochelle, I think you had mentioned about traffic, domestic travels to Japan and such. You know, the Japanese MLITT, what's that? Ministry of Land and Labor. Yes, thank you. Yeah, their goal, or Japanese government goal, is to hit 30 million travelers by 2025. So right now, I think last year was about 25 million. They're trying to hit 30 million, and you hear about the over-tourism a lot, especially in the major cities like Tokyo, Osaka. You go to Kyoto, it's a zoo, right? But the Japanese government, their goal is, their sights are set to get 60 million people by 2030. Now, how are you going to double that and be ready? Where do you put them exactly? So that's a big issue, I think, right now, and that's why they're doing their efforts to try to get people to go to the other cities outside from Tokyo or Osaka or Kyoto. They want you to go to, what's that? Chikuma, yes, places like that. So recently there have been a lot of JNTO, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, Japanese National Tourist Organization. A lot of times there have been many delegations from these other outside areas, whether it's Hokkaido or Kyushu up there, and to try to promote their areas to the American market or to the international market. But one of the key things I think there is, are they ready to accept all these Western or American travelers and such? So the infrastructure, that is something that they have to work on there. But because of that, ANA and also Japan Airlines were pushed by the government, Japanese government, to help promote this, get people to go to all these rural or regional. And it's basically it's a way to get those towns and cities to be sustainable, because especially during the pandemic, so many of the people left their rural towns and such. They can't support themselves, so they want tourism as a means of supporting the livelihood of their cities. So we have this, what we call the Japan Explorer Pass. It's a discounted ticket for foreigners. You must have an international ticket, and you could go to these various cities. Basically, instead of using rail, especially when it's far, like Tokyo to Kyushu, Tokyo to Hokkaido, and places like that, which if you try to go on train, it could take you 6 hours, 7, 8 hours, it could take you a whole day. Instead, fly, because it's cheap. I think recently the JR Pass is now, the coach is like 50,000 yen. It used to be, when I last used it, I think it was like 28,300. But now they increased it like 70%, and it's like 50,000. So using air, I mean, I could understand using the rail to go from point to point, but once you get the long haul, it'd be very advantageous to fly because it's not expensive. There you go. Anywhere from $54 and up to $100 per flight, per one-way segment. So the short routes like Tokyo Nagoya, $54, Osaka Matsuyama, or $77 for Tokyo Akita, Osaka Aomori, that's quite a distance. Or for example, $100 Tokyo Kyushu, which would take quite a while on rail. Nagoya Sapporo, that's quite a ways to get to Hokkaido. So these are excellent ways that you can book online, so long as you will have to input the information about your international ticket on it, so that we have proof that you are from overseas as well. ANA has a similar discounted domestic program for overseas travelers called the Super Value ANA Discover Japan Fair. Basically, it's the same thing, very similar. I don't know about their pricing, but of course these are from prices. So depending on how busy or hard the flights are, it will start escalating. But it is a wonderful way to get to see Japan and fly. And the one thing I must say about Japan domestic flights, it's not like here where you have to go 2 hours or 1.5 hours before the flight. In Japan, like domestic flight, you get there 30 minutes before.
It's like riding the bus.
Yes, exactly. And you go, they'll start checking in maybe 10, 15 minutes before the flight leaves, and 20 minutes before the flight leaves. And amazingly, it departs on time because everyone just knows to just line up, go in, put your stuff away, and sit down. Unlike here, where people are clogging up with too much luggage and such. So it's super efficient. So that's another thing to think about when flying domestically, and also that you get free Wi-Fi on domestic planes. So that's about it. Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So these are very attractive prices. These are a third or less of what you typically pay if you're a Japanese person flying these routes. So that is very appealing, and a lot less than the train.
Yes.
So, excellent. And then getting people, again, outside from the big cities to other places, which is great. So let's take a few minutes here and take questions. Do we have any questions? Raise your hand. Yes, over here. So do we want to bring the mic back? Okay.
Yes, thank you. And if you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, my name's Kerry Champion. So I had a question for Noah. You mentioned Japan becoming a hotspot for the development of AI models and products. But potentially, the bigger economic benefit is learning how to apply those, learning how to use those models to make existing industries more productive. So could you comment on whether or not you would see Japan as being successful at quickly applying these technologies and improving their productivity?
Well, yeah, turn this guy back on. Here, how about that? Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. So I don't know. With most industries, what happens is that geographic proximity will affect adoption. So for example, in America, like if you live in America, if you have your business in America, it's a little bit easier to maintain contact with software vendors for SaaS, stuff like that. And that has proven to be a bit of a benefit for American companies, that they have slightly better access to SaaS, both because of language, geographic proximity, and you can meet people more easily and work on solutions, especially for enterprise software. My intuition says that AI will function much like traditional SaaS or enterprise software in that respect, and that basically we've kind of had three big waves of SaaS. We had the first wave was like, let's teach companies how to use a database. The second wave was, let's teach companies how to use the internet. And the third wave will be, let's teach companies how to use AI in their business. And I expect it to be sort of like that. So I do expect geographic proximity to make a difference. But of course, Japanese companies will have to capitalize on that. And the well-known cultural problems in Japanese companies, which I don't need to go over here again, will make that harder. And so, but that's something that Japan is going to have to solve no matter what.
I have seen some statistics on adoption of using ChatGPT in your work. And the statistics I saw, if I recall correctly, was something like maybe 60% of people in China had been using ChatGPT for their work, somewhere between like 45 or 50% approximately in the United States, and then 10% in Japan. So much lower percentage. And again, it could be that proximity effect that Noah mentioned. I always wonder too if it's just lack of feeling like you can experiment with things at your work. But anyways, there's so far just much less usage.
Oh, it's because I think it's because all the training data is in English, and so therefore ChatGPT in Japanese sucks. It's not very good because there's just not much training data. Not much has been written in Japanese on the web, and so it was. The Chinese people who are using it are not using it as intensively because they're not doing their work in English. They're using it to try to translate something into English for international business.
I know certainly what I'm mostly using it for is translation. It's quite good for that. So,
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, next question. In the back in the black shirt.
Yeah.
One second, we're gonna get you the mic.
Do you want me to stand up?
No, you don't have to, but we'll bring you a mic though.
If you could introduce yourself, please.
I spent some time in Japan many years ago. One question that's being screamed about in the US that I always had a sense the Japanese had a better handle on is the whole issue of family values, and that's a very vague term, but consciously so. Would you care to say anything about how the Japanese deal with that whole issue?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I feel that families are generally a bit closer knit in America than Japan. I think that in America, it's traditional for parents to know where their kids are, whereas in Japan, it's traditional, it's not traditional, it's been true for about 40 years, that parents will give their kids money and let them run throughout the city and just say, go, kids. There's much less supervision of kids. There's not the same tradition of eating with the family together. And I don't know how much people like support their families. I know some people in Japan who send money to their families and some people in America who do, but obviously I don't know how much that says about it, but my sense is that people in America are supporting their families financially more, but that may just be because there's more bums or people who get into drugs or something. I don't know, but the point is that that I do feel that American families are a bit more close-knit. Now, maybe not as close-knit as families in a developing country, but where the family is an economic unit. But I think that Japanese families are a little more laissez-faire. Now, the converse of that is that Japanese families do much more elder care. You have the elderly parents live there. So maybe less child care, more elder care. That's my personal observation, and just from stuff that I've reading a bunch of, I don't know, Anne Allison books. Anne Allison's great, by the way, if you ever want to read some anthropology of someone who lived in Japan for many years. But then but yeah, so I don't know how that's going to change, but I think that you'll get this with immigrants, with people who move to Japan, have kids in Japan, and then just live there for the rest of their lives there. You're going to get culture shock where the kids are going to just treat life differently than the parents, and the grandkids completely differently. And by the time you get to the great grandkids, there'll be no difference. That takes 80 years, but there's going to be no difference between, culturally, between people who are fourth generation Japanese people and people who are 1,000 generations or however many generations they even have. Like, so then that's the pattern in America. I'm fourth generation American. Basically, I have no ancestral culture left. I notionally know that my ancestors came from Lithuania, but I've never been. And I don't know the first thing about Lithuania. And so anyway, I think you're going to have the same thing in Japan. As for how family culture works, I don't think it's going to be that big a difference, because I think that the Japanese tradition, which has been true since maybe the 60s, I guess, of taking traditionally male workers and separating them from their families by making them go out drinking all the time, so they don't go home and see the kids, that culture is on the wane. Possibly because companies can't afford it anymore, and they cut the Kosai tax break for this, for drinking. But then, you don't have, dads are doing more, and you can definitely see this all over Japan. So you don't necessarily have that culture that insists that and women are now all in the workforce, more part-time than men, but that's becoming slowly equalized. And I think you don't see this like in 1980s, it was very difficult to, in Japan, because the company would try to pull the working man away from the family, away from the wife and kids. And that's not as prevalent anymore. You still see a bit of that, but it's starting to become stigmatized, and it's just less common than it was. So I think I'm not so worried about that aspect of the issue.
Hi, my name is Christopher Chan. Noah, you mentioned that the Japanese local government is kind of weak, and the central government in Japan is strong. And I noticed here in California, the local government is very strong, and it's sort of like the state government is sort of weak. For example, when Newsom issues order like clean out the homeless, LA County and the city of LA said like, no, we're not going to comply with your order. Or when Newsom said about build new housing, like Huntington Beach said, no, we lift the middle finger, we're not going to comply with your edict. So is Japan, is the central government in Japan really that strong, and the local governments are really that weak?
One reason is because of fiscal federalism is much more prevalent in America. So in America, you'll notice that when the federal government wants to get involved in something like local housing policy, the Constitution says they can't do that. So instead, what they do is they say, we'll only give you HUD money if you build this number of houses. They make federal funding transfers from the central government conditional on what local governments do. In Japan, local governments rely much more on transfers from the central government for their funding than American local governments do. American local governments rely a lot on the state in California, but the states don't rely on federal transfers that much. So the federal control is relatively weak, and local governments actually can do a lot of their own finance with muni bonds, depending on the state. Property taxes, difficult in California because of Prop 13, but basically in Japan, if you're a local, prefectural government or small city government or whatever, you're relying on the central government a lot to transfer you money. And so then that means that the central government gets to tell you what to do.
That's about gentleman over here.
My name is Andrew Lee. I've been a long-time reader since during the macro wars. So all hail the cheap neoliberal shill. So
that was 13 years ago, by the way, for those who didn't follow that.
Yeah, so it's very exciting for me. I learned a lot about Japan through your writings, and then I remember one thing that I remember very clearly when you were writing about a series of blog posts about needed reforms for Japan. And I feel like I've been very impressed by how a lot of them actually come about. And I'm sure you're not the only one that's talking about it. But then one thing that I noticed recently was that there's been a lot of labor force reforms and corporate reforms done in Japan under Shinzo Abe and others. And so the female workforce participation has gone up a lot already. But I don't see a lot of at least from my vantage point, because I still don't know that much, is I don't see a lot of backlash to that, whereas you see a lot of political polarization by gender as a backlash to kind of labor participation, here in the US or in other countries. So I was wondering about is that present in Japan, I just haven't noticed it, or is there something about the fact that the dominant kind of center-right party is the one that brought through these reforms that kind of lessen the backlash?
Well, so the answer is I don't know. But then you have seen extreme gender polarization of politics in Korea, and I have no idea why. I don't know. I've seen the statistics, but I do not understand why that is the case. Japan, you have not seen as much. But then again, in Japan, you haven't seen polarization over anything. You haven't seen much regional polarization. You haven't seen much urban-rural polarization. You haven't seen, there's very little polarization in Japanese politics at all. And so I'd say that that's good. It's good to not have much polarization, but it's a double-edged sword, because sometimes polarization can help you get things done through the good old dialectical process of fighting movements will compete to do different things. It can paralyze your country, or it can actually get things done. I don't have a general answer to whether or not that's good. As for gender polarization, I just think that can't be good. It can't be good to have men and women on different sides of all these political issues. And it's happening in America too now. Oddly, in the time when women were entering the workforce in the 80s and 90s, were late 70s, 80s, and 90s were when women really stormed into the workforce in America and then into management ranks. That was at a low point for gender polarization in American politics. Gender polarization was lower in the 80s and 90s than it was elsewhere. And so that's interesting. And so the answer is those are some thoughts, but I really have no idea about this. So I don't have much thought about that. It's Japan handles gender stuff interestingly. In America, one of the big fight in the 70s was the Equal Rights Amendment, which said equal work pay for equal work. If you have the same job description, you get paid the same amount of money. Well, in Japan, that's always been the way it's been done. In Japan, your wage is set by your job description. There's much less. I mean, there's discretionary. There's some discretion in there, but it's much less than America. In America, you can have two people with the same job description. One person, look at levels.fyi and look at how much people at Google are getting paid, and look at the dispersion. You can have a 2x or even 3x variation in someone with the same level, and not in the government, but in private corporations. And so your job title is not determinative of what you get paid. In Japan, it's much more rigid, and this is probably in some ways it's a negative for Japan, because it means you can't reward initiative and merit, or you can't provide incentives for people to switch companies, and there's all these things you can't do. So that's probably something that needs to change. But a positive side effect of it, I guess, is that there's been less gender fights over wages in Japan. So anyway, that's just a thought on it.
Okay, gentleman in the, I think one say your hand is out in the yeah, exactly him. Sorry.
Hi there, Kazuma Makihara. I am both a reader and a member of the Japan Society, so I was really waiting for this crossover to happen. I'm very excited about it. You mentioned like policies that the Japanese government can take or should take to try and encourage more FDI. I guess more on the actual current political landscape. Like, do you have a view of any parties, politicians, people that do seem interested in trying to implement these kinds of policies, or is this more of a a recommendation, but whether people are actually kind of moving forward?
I mean, most of them, the Jiminto people, the LDP people, have become much more supportive of FDI. During Japan's catch-up development, there was massive attempts to discourage FDI, and that was true in Korea as well. Not true in China, interestingly. But basically, there was a lot of attempt to discourage FDI, say, give us your technology, but don't own anything here, because then Japan will forever occupy a subordinate place in supply chains. I think now what people have realized, based on the success of China, also the success of Malaysia, Poland, and other countries that have really developed with a lot more FDI, the technology transfer outweighs the ownership thing, because it's never actually that difficult to outcompete the people who invest in your country, if you want to. And this forces them, the knowledge of that forces them to transfer technology to the branch. And I think that people understand that in a way they didn't in 1965. And so, unfortunately, Japan has the institutional memory of discouraging FDI among companies, but the government has changed its mind. Keisansho has changed they've changed their mind. The industrial policy bureaucracy. They want FDI now, and they don't really know how to encourage it, but they've been doing really good with semiconductor companies in Kumamoto and some other things too. And interestingly, the FDI is coming from Taiwan and may come from Korea. It will be absolutely hilarious if Taiwanese and Korean companies end up bailing out the Japanese economy by investing in them. But it will be great. And it's like, that is great. I think that Taiwan's probably going to be a very big source of FDI for Japan, and that focusing on integrating the Japanese and Taiwanese economies. Also, this is dark to talk about this, but Japan needs to have a plan to offer asylum to every single person in Taiwan if Taiwan gets invaded, and that policy needs to be ready to go. And so that's a thing. But I think that
are people talking about that? Are you guys actually thinking about it?
No. Well, maybe they are behind closed doors.
Yeah.
But I don't know. So the UK had something like this for Hong Kong, and they actually had that ready to go years in advance. They were thinking about it a long time in advance. Japan is not thinking about like saving the whole country of Taiwan by letting Taiwanese people move to Japan in the millions. I don't know, it'd be good for the population, but also, it's something they should do. And the amount of business expertise in Taiwan is staggering. Taiwan is the land of highly successful small manufacturing. It's in that sense the Germany of Asia. It has the Mittelstand, and Taiwan also it's the most gender equal country in Asia, and except for Scandinavia, the most gender equal country in the world. Colloquially, Taiwanese women run stuff, and so that would be a very salutary sort of cultural thing for Japanese companies to learn from Taiwan as well. And so I think that there will be some FDI from America, there'll be some FDI from Europe, some from Korea, but I think Taiwan's going to be like #1 place to just build stuff in Japan. And they need to be, so to encourage FDI, they're going to need to cut local government red tape. So local governments may be fiscally dependent on the center, but they also can make their own regulations for setting up a business. And friends of mine who are opening branch offices in Japan say the federal government has made it very easy to do this, super streamlined at the central government level. But local government, like Tokyo government, is still a nightmare to get through the paperwork. And so making it very easy to do all the local government stuff would make FDI a lot easier. There's also other various services that you can provide, but private business can do a lot of this. Making it really, really easy to find good housing, like just show up and find housing, is a must. And some companies are doing this already. One difficulty is that Japan doesn't have leases, because of their underdeveloped legal system. They don't have leases, and so you have to pay key money to get into apartments. And the key money is a deposit, basically in case you leave the apartment early. You know, it's not like in New York where the key money is on top of a lease because the mafia just extorts you. Like that's New York. But in Japan, it's actually just insurance. And you know, when I live in Japan, I'm able to avoid key money by paying a year up front. Then I get no key money. I just offer the fudosan. I'm just like, okay, you're up front here. And they're like, okay, no key money. Yeah, so there's a lot of little things like that the government needs to think about harmonizing to make it really easy to get foreign entrepreneurs and people setting up foreign, you know, branch offices of foreign companies, like large startups, you know, Series C startups as well.
I think there's just also the issue of there are so many Japanese landlords that won't rent to non-Japanese.
Is that true?
Yes, it's a huge issue, yeah.
Huh.
And it's not so much an issue at like executive level, expatriate departments, but more for your average workers. Tremendous number of landlords who are scared to rent to foreigners, who have heard about a bad story about someone who rented a foreigner and had such and such happen. And then these rumors circulate. And so it's very, very difficult. Just pretty high percentage that just won't rent to any foreigner at all.
Yeah. Well, in their defense, I wouldn't rent to me either. But but there's a couple things you can do. Number one, you can just ban it. I don't know, maybe that'll work. Number two.
But that's what we do in the US. We have anti-discrimination laws, but they don't have any laws like that.
I mean, it sort of almost works. It would be hard to ban because you can't really sue in Japan. Like but a lot easier thing to do would be to set up a thing where people who want to rent apartments like can easily just like give information about what they do to the Japanese government. The government will just vouch for you. If you're like, oh, I'm setting up a branch of a foreign company here in Tokyo and stuff like that. They're like, okay, upload your documents. You know, you do that in order to get a permit anyway. And they're like, oh, we'll vouch for you. And then like the government will just vouch for these people to the landlords. And then if the people cause a problem, then the landlords can yell at the government.
There are some private companies that are trying to do something similar to that. Yeah.
The market will solve it.
Yeah. I don't know if it has yet, but there'd be a possibility. Well, I'm taking a glance at the clock. Well, maybe just one last question here. That's about Kelly.
If you have any more questions for me, you can just come up and ask me after. What the hell? I've been standing around.
Thank you. Well, we haven't talked much about Paris in this lecture. So I wanted to ask a question, maybe the last, which is, for me, and I think for a lot of your audience, when we think of Paris as being this destination for travelers and expatriates and people who wanted a more exotic lifestyle, we think of the late 19th and early 20th century and the arts culture that Paris was famous for. Everyone from Josephine Baker to writers studying architecture at the Sorbonne, you know, the things that are steeped in the mythos of Paris as an elegant city that you want to go to. How, in your both opinions, will Japan compare to that? I guess education and art, like higher education, you know, sort of the kind of education that you don't like have to have, like the language stuff, but like the more, you know, the more erudite stuff. And is that part of what Japanese tourism can take advantage of maybe for the next, you know, generation or two as you're talking about it?
Well, that's what my first post was actually about, and I didn't want to belabor that because I didn't want to talk too much about France in a talk. But I do have thoughts. But first, Rochelle knows more about this than I do.
Oh, I'll just say, you know, that's definitely one thing for me that's a great attraction of living in Tokyo is, you know, one of my original interests in Japan was in Japanese culture, and I can live in Tokyo and go to great art exhibits. And I recently got talked by a friend into buying a kimono, and so then I'm like, yeah, I now have my neighborhood kimono dresser who dresses me in my kimono if I'm going out with friends. And when I have time, I've been going to Japanese flower arrangement lessons. So there's all these traditional cultural things that are right there around me and very accessible and very interesting. I also feel that, you know, and maybe it's just the people I'm friends with, but I feel like a lot of Japanese are very into studying, talking about books, talking about what they're reading. It's a very intellectual type of environment that also I just find very stimulating. And also there's very smart and interesting people from all over the world who are attracted to Tokyo, and that creates an interesting milieu. So I like all those elements.
Yeah, I first wrote Tokyo's the New Paris because I realized the staggering number of artists and writers who now either want to live in Japan, do live in Japan, or live part-time in Japan. It's so much more than people realize. So many, pop stars, or, like so many composers are living in Japan you don't even know. So many authors live either part of the time or just have done some years in Japan, etc. The way they used to do in Paris. I went there. My friend is she's an illustrator. She made the characters for Reddit or whatever, and makes comic books and whatever. We went to Japan last summer. And then we wandered into my favorite little art gallery, Tokyo Design Festa Gallery, in the back of Harajuku. And we were there. And there was a thing where you could come up and do your own illustration. And she found so many other illustrators that she knew from America and from France when she had lived in France, with their things on the wall. And they can only do that in person. If you go to that gallery, you can't mail it in. All right. You have to go there and draw it on their little table. And all these people were in Japan. And just the staggering number of people, people who created many of the most famous websites in America, now they live in Japan and just nobody knows because they stay a little off the grid. A lot of rich people. Yeah, and you'd see in the mid 20th century, or especially early 20th century, you'd see people write written from Paris and Prague and blah, 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 like at the start of their books. People don't really do this anymore. It's easy enough to fly around, and we have the internet where you can seem like you're in America, even if you're in Japan. So I think people don't know how many creatives are in Japan, or how many people who could choose anywhere to live are in Japan. But everyone I know who sells their company, who sells out, everyone either travels constantly to Japan or just moves there and lives in Japan for a while. I just go to Japan, I see people I know from America on the street, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I've been living here a while." I was like, "Oh, I see you on Twitter." And so I don't think it's to the level of what Paris was in, say, the 1920s, which is, this famous Ernest Hemingway, Lost Generation kind of thing. I don't think it is to that level yet, but it's heading in that direction. And it is heading in the direction of it. I have friends who run the Tokyo Fashion Instagram site, and they're manically obsessed with photographing fashion people, and that's one of their multiple jobs. They're these very, autistic Gen X type Americans who just moved to Japan and started doing this. And they're great people. I love them. They know all the fashion designers who come to Japan. Every fashion designer lives part-time in Japan now. It's just, people don't realize it yet, but I hope that people will soon realize all the other people who are living in Japan too, from around the world, and start connecting with each other, in cheesy expat cafes. And then we'll get some cheesy overwrought novels about the lost generation who all moved to Japan. Anyway, I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, well, I think we have that to look forward to. I think this is probably a good place to wrap up the formal part of our program. But thanks to our generous hosts, we have drinks and food, and we can stay here for another half hour or so. So this is a chance to, anyone who has more questions for Noah, who wants to ask them, can ask them one-on-one, and also just mix and mingle with each other. So I want to thank all of you for coming. And I know for a lot of people, this is your first Japan Society program, and I hope you will join us for other ones. We have lots of great ones. Thanks so much.
Building bridges between the United States and Japan since 1905. Japan Society.